Welcome to the Healing Motherhood Podcast. I'm so happy you're here. Today, we are talking a little bit about the more common causes of birth trauma and even some of the less well-known ones, the secret causes of birth trauma, if you will. So, we've all heard these birth horror stories, right? Where the mom almost dies or where the mom actually does lose the baby. And if that is your story, I am holding so much space for you. And today we're diving into the secret causes of birth trauma. Birth trauma used to be something that people only used to describe really big physical birth injuries, or what we would call a near miss, which is where, like I was talking about before, where the mom actually almost dies. So when we're talking about the secret causes of birth trauma, right, we are talking about things that people don't even necessarily realize are traumatic, right? Even emergency cesareans, sometimes people can be like, oh my goodness, was everything okay? But they don't necessarily realize the actual impact that it can have as a traumatic event. And remember, we talked a little bit about birth trauma in our last episode, but a traumatic event actually makes a change in the brain, right? It is a psychological injury to the brain. So what we don't necessarily realize is that even things like emergency cesarean sections can cause things like flashbacks, things like nightmares, right? They can have this impact on how we perceive motherhood to be, and the world, in fact. So I think it's really important to point out in this episode that birth trauma isn't just birth experiences that result in a near miss. It isn't just birth experiences that result in a massive tear or injury to mother or baby. Birth trauma is what happens inside of somebody. Trauma is what happens inside of the brain during and after an event, right? So emergency cesarean, emergency procedures are something that can cause trauma. Another thing that can cause trauma is a loss of control or a perceived loss of control over one's body, over the birthing process. It can be due to medical interventions. It can be due to medical complications, right? It can be created even in the way that a nurse or a doctor or an anesthesiologist, any provider of any kind, interacts with the mother, right? And so we will dive even deeper into this in our series coming up regarding the themes of birth trauma. But for now, we're just talking about some of those less recognized causes. Another one is kind of a lack of support in the birthing process, right? Whether that is by healthcare providers, family members, partners, if you hired a doula, not having the support that you thought that you would have from them. And then another one that I'm not sure why we don't talk about more is previous trauma, especially those with a history of sexual assault. Previous trauma has a large impact on how we are feeling during the birthing process. And if we're not surrounded by trauma-informed providers, that impact is tenfold, okay? And so I think it's really important for providers to be, getting an idea of their client's history, right? What was their childhood like? Is there childhood trauma that's going to come up? Is there sexual trauma that's going to come up? And the thing is when we are giving birth, we are feeling sensations in spaces that may have been violated before, and we are possibly experiencing interventions that feel like violation, right? So I think it's really important to dive into any previous traumas with a professional before giving birth. But also, if you have been feeling some of the things that I explained in the last episode about birth trauma, if you have been feeling like, oh, my birth felt awful and I don't understand why, something that can kind of help to explain it is if you do have that background of trauma, right? Another thing that can have an impact on how birth is perceived and experienced is your perception of birth, right? Our society has created this picture of birth being this horrible and scary thing. And so I think it's important to realize that a lot of people are going into that. Either they're going into it with this Hollywood picture, right, of screaming and fear and pain, or maybe they've been on Instagram and YouTube watching only positive birth experiences where there's music over the natural noises of labor, and they think, oh, it's going to be this beautiful rite of passage. And yes, it absolutely can be. And those videos aren't portraying reality, right? They're not showing us a full picture of a 24-hour, 48-hour labor where this mom has been battling with all of her self-limiting beliefs, all of her previous trauma coming straight up to the surface for her to deal with, for her to move through, right? It is showing us this 5-minute clip of the baby emerging. Whether the mom is roaring the baby out or not, it's covered in beautiful music, right? Another thing that people do not realize causes birth trauma is lack of information and preparation. When we do not have the information about something, when we do not have a good, solid understanding of what's happening to our body, that can cause trauma. When we have something that happens that is completely unexpected that we didn't realize was a part of the process, that can feel really scary. And depending on our history and our own brain, that can be turned into and stored as trauma. And then another thing to think about is, a history of PTSD, whatever the cause was, is an important thing to think about as a potential contributor to birth trauma. And then one other thing to think about is maybe you don't feel like your birth was traumatic, and that's okay. That you are here in this space anyway, right? I have had many people come to me and they say, I had this beautiful birth, but I really am struggling with this part of it, right? That is okay. And I think it's important to note that birth trauma can result from even experiences that seem routine to providers or seem beautiful from the outside, right? From other people witnessing that birth or from a seemingly positive birth experience, right? There is this anecdote that many people share, and in fact, they even put it on the board in labor at my hospital, is, as long as there's a healthy baby, right? All that matters is a healthy baby. On the board in my hospital the goal was healthy mom, healthy baby. And I pointed it out to my doula, so this was for my second. And I said, oh yeah, look at the board. There it is right there in black and white. All that matters to my team is that we live, right? And that's, that's like the bar is so low that nothing else matters, is what it felt like. Because we have this, people say after a difficult birth, they say, oh, all that matters is a healthy baby. Thank goodness you're both okay, right? And that, we'll dive deeper into that in its own episode, right? That is toxic positivity. That statement deserves an episode all its own. But my point is that your experience matters too, right? And the way that a mother is made to feel in the time that she has given birth has a strong impact on the beginning of her motherhood. entering motherhood with symptoms of PTSD is a big deal. And it's not okay. So I think we need to, raise the bar a little bit and put people's actual birth goals on the whiteboard. Just saying. So in that particular example, my doula literally went up and changed it to the goal of our birth, which was a VBAC without an epidural. And so I think it's important to acknowledge people's desires, to acknowledge their wants, right? So I'd love to know in the comments below, do you relate to any of this? Did you have a birth experience that left you feeling just disappointed? Or do you have a birth experience that left you feeling traumatized? Drop a comment and let me know. And if you had any big feelings brought up by this, I just want you to know there are resources in the show notes. And there is also a link to my waitlist. I'm working on something just for you. Thank you so much for being here today. Remember to hit subscribe because we're doing a series on the themes of birth trauma next.